The Petrie family, the family that took time to bring you good wine, invites you to listen to Dr. Watson tell another exciting adventure he shared with that master detective, his old friend, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Eddie Webb.
I'm Chris Buddy.
And today we're going to talk about Sherlock Holmes in the 1940s here on Genreless. Hello and welcome to our ongoing chronological exploration of Sherlock Holmes. But before we get started, we do have a bit of housekeeping we need to resolve because last episode, somebody demanded that I come up with a recommendation for a Hammer horror film.
Do you realize, of course, that I totally forgot I said that?
I know you did. Hoist on your own petard, my friends. I have a game. Well, you now have to live with your choices because I have a recommendation. It's a bit of an outlier, so that way it gives Chris more room to think of something a little more mainstream in Hammer horror. But I have chosen The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires from 1974, which was their attempt at a kind of a cross promotion with a Hong Kong studio. And it is just amazingly terrible. It is Van Helsing fighting vampires all over the world, and it's just wonderful. How about you, Chris? What Hammer horror movie would you recommend?
I'm gonna go with Horror of Dracula.
That's good. It's good. Nice classic one.
Well, it's classic. It's one of the first ones that helped establish it. So people can also go for the black and white vibe to fit with our Sherlock run right now.
Yeah, I almost went with the Quatermass experiment, but I figured we did that in Doctor Who, so.
I don't remember how good that one was, though. You were really recommending a good one.
It's fair. I only remember there was actually a remake around 2000-ish, about 20 years ago. BBC did, but they filmed it live, just like some of the original Quatermass serials. But Tennant was playing Dr. Quatermass. And so
he's in everything.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, it was definitely that time. Well, I'll say that time period where he was in everything, but act like that hasn't been the past 20 years. But it was neat because it was, again, they filmed and broadcast it live. So they actually did it 2 or 3 times to make sure all the different time slots. And then they compiled it into, I think, the best takes version. It's slightly edited for an actual release, but it's still some of the flubs and the camera moves and whatnot of that original style of television, which is fascinating to see recreated in early 2000s technology.
New game for you now, right here on the spot, since you said that,
God
so we don't have to research it later. What is the best, worst David Tennant thing? So it can't be Doctor Who because Tennant's exceptional in Doctor Who. So it can't be that. Can't be Jessica Jones because it's exceptional Purple Man.
He's exceptional. Honestly, I would probably say the Quatermass experiment because I take it back. No, the best worst thing he's been in is in the Big Finish audio Colditz, where he plays a Nazi.
Yeah.
He has a terrible German accent. It's amazing.
I will give you, for me, I think it's Viva Blackpool that had
nice.
The Next Doctor. It's a Doctor Who joke right there himself, and Tennant in it, and it was about this guy who's buying arcades, who's sort of a criminal, and it's a musical TV series, and David Tennant is the bad cop.
Oh God.
Yeah.
He plays a bad cop in a couple of shows actually, because he was kind of a bad cop in Broadchurch too, wasn't he?
If he was a bad cop, I meant bad cop as in corrupt cop, not bad cop as I'm not good at my job.
Sorry. Yeah, no, he's kind of a jerk and bad at his job in Broadchurch, I think. But it's been a while since I watched Broadchurch.
And like Viva Blackpool, he's a corrupt cop.
Right. But Broadchurch is another cop show where 2 people playing the Doctor are in it. So take that for what you will.
Maybe we'll just
Even
do
when we're
like
not
a
talking about Doctor
David
Who, we're talking
Tennant
about Doctor
cast
Who.
instead.
Huh?
We'll change it. We'll change the entire podcast to just like the Tennant cast, and we talk about how great David Tennant is for
Right.
an entire run.
Right. We'll get his wife on and talk about him. That'd be great. No, we are here to talk about Sherlock Holmes, and we're talking about Basil Rathbone. It was kind of the David Tennant of his day, to be fair.
So, are you? I was about to ask you. Do you think David Tennant could play Sherlock Holmes?
Honestly, no, I don't. I really don't.
Why is that? For on the
Um,
Tennant cast today.
oh, I say sorry. Well, for two reasons. One, I do not think he has the Tennant's a very expressive actor, and Holmes is kind of a minimalist character, and so Tennant would have to tuck it way back in order to play Holmes, and I don't think that would work well for him. That's not the way of acting he does. And two, we do have an example of a Doctor Who actor trying to play Sherlock Holmes, and that did not pan out well.
It doesn't count if it's Tom Baker.
It does kind of as Tom Baker.
It does not count as Tom Baker. That was from a totally different era of acting. Does not count if it's Tom Baker. Plus, it's Tom Baker. Even when Tom Baker is acting, Tom Baker is Tom Baker at maybe an 11 compared to Tom Baker in existence at what, a 9?
Tom Baker is excellent at playing Tom Baker. Nobody can play Tom Baker as well as Tom Baker.
But Tom Baker can't play Sherlock because it's not
Tom Baker.
Tom Baker, Sherlock playing Tom Baker. It's just Tom
That's kind of
Baker
my
in a
point, right? Like,
Deerstalker.
um, there is a certain style of playing Holmes that can be very wacky and zany. I mean, the 2009 Sherlock Holmes movie is an example of that. That I've never found. It takes a very specific way of doing it that works well. Tom Baker does not do it well, and I don't think David Tennant would do it very well, frankly. I think
But
Matt
you would
Smith
say
might do a
that
pretty good job.
you'd say that Will Ferrell could do it though.
I do not say Will Ferrell can do it. I never said that.
He was in a Sherlock Holmes movie.
He was in a movie where he played Sherlock Holmes. That is different. It's
Oh
not different.
god.
I had never seen that movie. I have no desire to see that movie. If you
Neither
ask
have
me
I.
to review that movie, I will quit this podcast immediately and you'll have to find a new co-host.
You would not be alone with that. So you're saying though that Benedict Cumberbatch could play Sherlock, but Tennant couldn't play Sherlock. So can Cumberbatch play the Doctor?
Also, no. I think Cumberbatch. Well, maybe, but it would have to be a very different version of the Doctor. Um, I just don't think Cumberbatch has the warmth to do it, frankly.
Then with that in mind, you would say that Cumberbatch could play one of the old school Doctors, but not the new wave Doctors.
Yeah, if he was doing something akin to, like, say, the first Doctor, maybe. Like I said, it have to be a very different interpretation of the Doctor. But the way Doctor is portrayed the past 40 plus years, no.
Interesting. Okay.
So Basil Rathbone.
All right. So that is the final episode of our Tennant cast. It was a nice long epic run of 100 episodes of just talking about David Tennant. We hope you'll tune in next time.
I love how you act like we're never going to talk about David Tennant ever again.
David who?
Right. What about his son? His son has a career now.
Yeah, Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah, that went well. So 1940s. I've picked an episode, a run of 5 episodes. I'll get more context later, but I'd say I picked 5 episodes kind of in the middle of this epic run because after the 2 movies we saw became reasonably big hits, the NBC network decided they wanted to do a radio spinoff of those movies. So 1939, they commissioned a radio series with Nigel Bruce and Basil Rathbone, and that lasted beyond the movies themselves. Lasted 1946 actually, so it was a really long run. And radio on those days, there were not a lot of recorded repeats. So a lot of those were done live and bespoke. So there's well over 100 episodes. I think like maybe 200 episodes that were done. We don't have many of them left because of a variety of reasons. Most of the right ones, once we have, are when they're recorded to be sent overseas, so the armed forces could listen to them,
Mhm.
which is when they first started actually doing recordings of these. But a lot of the a lot of the late 30s, early 40s, we don't have any more records of. Um, but it's an interesting show. And one of the reasons why I want to kind of cover this is partially because this is the other piece of the cementing Bruce and Rathbone as kind of the iconic Holmes and Watson, but also how different their characters are from their movie portrayals.
And the other thing that you're talking about how long the show ran is that Rathbone stayed for most of it. I think he left by the last 30-ish odd
Yeah.
episodes, and
Hmm.
someone else stepped in because he didn't want to be typecast
Right.
anymore. I think, but at this point, it's a little late.
Yeah, that damage was done. Bruce did the entire run,
And
though, I believe.
I want to say it was maybe like the last 30 episodes, and that's definitely when it kind of went, and we're done with this. What Eddie doesn't know is that I used to have box sets of these as a kid, and I would listen to them ad
Oh,
nauseum. So
wow.
for me, this is like going back to being what 8 to 9 year old Chris sitting there
Yeah.
with like my little jam box that what I wish would turn into a transformer, but wouldn't. Listening to like these on cassette tapes because I'd gotten them as a present, a big box of them.
I got them from the library as cassettes. I didn't get them. I never owned them. But yeah, I've also listened to some of these as cassettes. And also, my one of my grandmothers would listen to a radio program. I don't remember what station it was. It was some podunk station in Ohio, but they would occasionally replay old radio programs like a very specific slot of time. And so occasionally Sherlock Holmes would come on, and inevitably it was a Bruce and Rathbone one. So yeah, so I
So,
mean, I also kind of grew up with these on some level too.
and this is what I think got me so much into actual radio from the 30s to the 50s. And I would just buy those different radio shows and everything else time that would show up. But it also gave me an interest in how radio was pioneered. And it's why people may have heard me talk about it before, and at least in passing, how I think one of the best TV shows is Remember When. It's about
Hmm.
life in a 1930s radio station right before the war happens. It's sort of a 30s sitcom drama that was on AMC. I want to say it was AMC's first actual like television show that they made. And they tried to bury it for a while to replace it with like something called The Lot, which was more about 40s and 50s Hollywood. They only got a season because it wasn't as good as the other show that was written, I want to say, by Rupert Holmes. And anyone would also know that I'm playing around with like this radio idea that I have for something I'm working on.
So what you're saying is there's a direct line from Remember When to Breaking Bad.
Yes. It could also even say The Walking Dead.
Oh God, I'd rather not, but you're probably right.
Well, no. So just random tidbit about me that I didn't even think Eddie knew is that I grew up so much with like these and all the other radio shows.
Well, I knew you liked this era, which is why I was happy to include a radio era, but I didn't realize you had a specific connection to this show. That's actually really cool.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Uh, I
we, I
think I
so
even remember not the Book of Tabit, but I want to say that I remember the Tobaccoist
Oh
specifically.
wow, okay. Yeah, so what I did is I tried to find a block of episodes that were more or less continuous, just to get a sense of like what it was kind of like. So this run actually goes from March 26th, 1945 to the end of April 30th, 1945. So this is pretty much 5 episodes as they would have been in order from those time period, and it's deep into what I like to call the Petri Wine era, because they were the second major sponsor, and frankly that's the era that we have most of the recordings from. So that's the only one I ever knew existed for like years. I thought Petron was the only ever sponsor for this show.
So, are you saying that we can give an alcoholic beverage its kudos for letting us have Sherlock Holmes in the modern day?
Yes, yes, that's absolutely true. In much the same way that I deeply remember DeSoto being the sponsor for the uh, the Marks game show, which is I'm not suddenly forgot the name of. What's my line? Yes, what's my line? No, whatever.
Now you're
The one that,
making now you're confusing. I think with whose line is it anyway?
yeah,
Which
yeah,
is definitely not.
I'm,
Marx.
I think at the Groucho Marx game show where they had the duck with the secret word. I just don't know why I'm blanking on the name, uh, but I
It's
don't
not
know.
Duck Soup because that's the movie.
No,
Now I don't know now.
I'll remember after we stop recording. But again, part of the fun of listening to these is just how things are done differently, but also just hearing all the companies no longer exist. They're sponsoring these, right? They only
And it was
exist
also
now as
nice.
these recordings.
And it's nice to hear the talks for like the war bonds, trying to get people to go and
Yeah,
support the war effort. It was huge.
yeah, yeah. It was again very different, but very much the same. Like how they did advertising is very much what we would now call kind of product placement. So it very much there was one advertiser and it frames the whole show. Like again, the Groucho Marx show that I continued to blank on. Um, uh, they actually had DeSoto as part of the jingle for the actual and kind of introductory song for a long time. So there was the sponsors were very embedded into these episodes in a way that we don't quite see, although it is coming back. Like I just saw an article the other day that's Coronation Street, which is one of the longest running soap operas here in the UK. They're going to have Sainsbury's on the road where all the action takes place. Sainsbury's is one of the big grocery store chains here, supermarket chains here. So as they go up and down the Coronation Street and do stuff, you're occasionally in the background you're going to see this Sainsbury's, which is fascinating because it's not quite the same thing, but it's walking quite up that line of how things used to be done for advertising.
Do we want? And I love doing this on recorded air because Eddie always gets this look on his face. Do we want to do a series run about Coronation Street?
I've
Because
not
I
seen
think that
Coronation
would
Street.
be fascinating.
I mean, maybe like just one episode, because you can find some episodes of it lingering around. Um,
We could do the
maybe
soap
we could.
opera thing that we talked about.
True. And then we could do. Technically, we could do, you just had to do even more episodes of well, whatever. Yeah, maybe we
Come
could do
on,
Coronation.
there could be like some Coronation Street in there. Then we could do a compare and contrast with something like Days of Our Lives for the U.S. version.
We
We
can
could
also do
have
Dark
where
Shadows.
that's what I was gonna transition to too. So there's that middle
Uh,
ground. I was gonna just saying. All right, put it to the side. Right now, we're here to talk about Petri wine, the best
Petri wine,
wine.
right? And so these half-hour episodes, but also they were framed very differently. They were closer to how the original stories were written in the sense that they were all told from Watson's perspective, and so for audio, the frame was it was Watson telling a story to the announcer, who in this case was someone who was weirdly obsessed with Petri wine for some reason. It's always funny how like again, if you listen to a single episode, it's not that weird. But we listen to several episodes in a row, it's like, why is this guy so fucking obsessed with this very specific wine? It's a mania. This guy needs to go into therapy.
You all right? You need to look at it. I think like this, my friend. You have Watson, who is equivalent of Doyle for these people, who is super famous, and this
Right.
person has invited Watson over to his house. The most expensive bottles of wine he has are Petri wines. And so he's pouring them for this famed author slash doctor slash adventurer to come and hang out with him and regale him with stories. And
Right.
the only way he can get Watson to stay is if he keeps Watson drunk and talks about how great Petri wine is. And Watson would have heard how expensive Petri wine is. So he's like, oh yes, Petri wine. I love it too. And so that is what's happening right there.
Which is even more hilarious because the original sponsor was bromoquinine. So it's like give much rich food. Oh, you feel terrible? Well, I'll give you some medication for that if you tell me a story.
That in my head canon, that's what's going on.
Good. I accept it. It's canon now. But so as a result of this reframing, though, Watson does become slightly more competent than he is portrayed in the movies. The divide between Watson's competency in the movies and the radio show bifurcates pretty heavily by the time we get to 45, right? But how we saw him in 39 and how we hear him here is pretty similar. but he gets way worse in the movies. So like it's interesting. It kind of keeps this modest keel of not quite comedy relief, but still not great. Whereas in the movies, he's again stepping in buckets and being confused by the fact he's stepping in a bucket. I'm never gonna be not mad about that.
Does your doctor not encounter this problem?
No, my doctor seems to avoid buckets on a pretty regular basis.
Having recently watched the Hot Ones with Conan O'Brien, who has his own physician comes in, I would say his physician on that episode of Hot Ones is on par with Watson's capability in the bucket.
I actually need to watch that because watching Conan and Brian trying to eat hot wings actually does sounds hilarious.
It is hilarious. We got on a side tangent. We got on a Hot Ones kick this weekend because
Oh,
my daughter was having a big sleepover with some friends. And while they were in the other room, they would keep popping into our room, into like the main living room where we were. So we wanted to watch something that was funny, that was easy to pause if they came into the
right,
room. And if they saw it, you see Conan O'Brien dying eating hot wings, or you see Sterling K. Brown trying to be cool while eating hot wings.
right,
So
yeah. Yeah, there we go. Do a hot wings episode. That'll last 20
it
seconds.
is fascinating if you watch it. I don't remember his name, but the interviewer is exceptional. I think that you would you would say kudos to that person's skills as a
No, no,
good
no,
interviewer
don't get me wrong.
yourself.
No, don't get me wrong. Like I actually I originally watched it because like it's a funny interview show about people eating hot wings. But no, the interview is actually genuinely fantastic. Right, he's one of the best interviewers I've seen. Like David Letterman's about the only other person off the top of my head I could think was a better interviewer. Um, and even then, David Letterman's new Netflix show, he's fantastic in that as an interviewer. Um, so yeah, no, he's just a really good interviewer that happens to structure the interview around eating hot wings, which is just bizarre and funny.
That's how you get the kids in. But
Right,
if you're an interviewer, one of the things I think you should definitely watch Hot Wings because you can see the type of questions that are asked and the way that people respond to the questions because they're being asked things they've never been asked before,
right,
which shows that you were someone that went out of your way to research about them and try to
right.
find something to connect with. That is unbelievably powerful.
Yeah, yeah. No, again, that's why I like again watching David Letterman's interviews because he's usually really good about saying, "I'm not here to talk to you about." At least in his new show, it's like, "I don't want to talk about your latest project. I want to talk about you." And he gets really into it, which is fantastic.
I do have a question for you, though, Eddie.
What?
Can you tell me about Petri wine?
No, actually, I don't know. I know it's a company that used to make wine. I don't They don't exist anymore. Um, for some reason, I did not actually research that. Uh, it looks like it's in 1953, it was the largest domestic producer of wine in the United States, actually.
Look
So
at
that's
that.
fascinating. But they sold to United Vintners in 1968, uh, which is why they're no longer around now. But they were around for like 70 years before they sold out. I knew that much. So they were
Petri
actually a
wine.
pretty well-established brand. Um, they would have been around 50 years old by the time these shows would have aired. So
Yeah. All right. Are we here to talk about Petri wine, or are we here to talk about Watson rambling about Petri wine? Which one of those two options are we going to take?
well, I mean, we're talking about Watson, but I mean, honestly, as much as the characterization of Watson frustrates me, the radio show is why I actually like Bruce is because there is charm in Watson because he's not only just kind of doing a dry introduction to the story because his role really besides playing Watson, his role as the current Watson as opposed to past Watson is to kind of just set the scene, and then after a few sentences, they fade into the actual radio structure proper, and then at the end of it, he does a quick recap and then reads it out. But by this point, there's always little anecdotes about Watson's life in 1945. Uh, and I've always found that charming. Like, he's talking about walking his dogs, or he's talking about, he fell asleep on a bench or whatever. So, it's always it's always some kind of contrived way of like this thing happened to me, and that reminds me of this story that I'm going to tell you today. Um, it's clearly contrived, but Bruce does give a kind of it's very organic how he presents it that makes you believe this really is a man who's just telling you stories about his amazing friends. And so, as much as I give stick to how Bruce is forced to portray Watson in the stories, him as the narrator for these stories, I've always really loved.
Absolutely. So, what is
Uh,
the
so,
first one?
so yeah, I was gonna say, let's go in the first one, Book of Tobit. So it's set in the early 1900s. There's a magician's assistant named Jasmine de Fleur, whose real name is Lady Diana Vennering. Her husband, Lord Vennering, is murdered on their wedding day, and Major Beckworth is arrested by the suspects. Sherlock Holmes and Watson attend the trial as the jury deliberates on the verdict, which is not guilty. Holmes talks about how the Book of Talbot from the Bible mirrors Lady Vettering's plight, as the demon Asmodeus strangled 7 husbands on their wedding night before reading in a paper that Lady Vettering plans to marry the suspect in her husband's murder if she's acquitted, which seems really sudden and super weird. The next day, the Reverend Arthur Wayland arrives at 221B and points out the connection to the case of Talbot, in case we missed it the first time. And each victim was threatened with a note written in ancient Hebrew and signed Asmodeus. Wayland asks Holmes to warn Lady Vettering, but she seems unconcerned. During the discussion, an Irish painter and former lover named Peter confronts her about the marriage, and she kicks him out. Holmes deduces that Lady Vettering has secretly married Major Beckworth that morning, and Watson points out that Wayland already knew she was married when he consulted with Holmes, if that's true. When Holmes asks to speak with Beckworth, they're informed that he has been stabbed. A month later, Holmes starts courting Lady Vettering, now Diana Beckworth, and Reverend Wayland tries to stop him from dating her. Holmes later tells Watson he plans to marry Diana, which Watson warns him against. Holmes says Wayland won't perform a ceremony but will be present. During the ceremony, Holmes receives a threatening note from Asmodeus, and after he admits it to Watson, he heads upstairs to his new home. Later, he calls out for Watson to help him with the attempted murderer, Diana Holmes slash Beckworth slash Vettering. Holmes reveals that the entire wedding was a sham and the clergyman was actually his brother Mycroft in disguise. And I picked these episodes just because I was trying to find a block of 5 episodes we could find easily online. I was not prepared for how batshit this episode was. It was a great way to start this run because it is just, oh my god.
Explain your statement, Eddie. Are you saying that Arthur Conan Doyle did not write this? Is that what you're telling me? These are not lifted directly from the page?
That's an interesting point. They did adapt some of the original stories, but we're now into it was rebranded The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, although I don't think the radio show called it that. But they're all written by Edith Meiser, actually, not Conan Doyle. So these are all brand new adventures. That was the other criteria I was trying to avoid adaptations of existing episodes. So this is brand new, although it is similar to bits and pieces of the stories, which you'll find in a lot of news shows. Like, oh, there's references to this. So like Holmes dating someone to get information actually has happened in one of the stories. Him getting married just to catch a murderer, maybe a bit excessive. But
all right.
maybe arranging a false wedding.
I want to take one more step back. You mentioned who the writer was. Do you know anything about the writer themselves?
I don't, unfortunately.
Okay.
I just know that she wrote for the first 5 seasons, and then after last season, it was taken over by Dennis Green and Anthony Boucher. Anthony Boucher went on to write another Sherlock Holmes radio series for the BBC, I believe. But beyond that, I don't know much about. Actually, I don't know much about most of the staff or people, the creative team who worked on this. Just I was surprised to find that there was a single writer for 5 entire seasons of this radio show.
Which is pretty fascinating. Now I may actually have to go look them up and find out more about them just because that's
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah, it's great.
All right, I put my serious podcaster face back on. How did you like the opening of this story?
um, it was okay. Um, I mean, I do like the overall structure that the beginning of the story presents a pretty obvious suspect, and then spends a lot of time trying to deflect attention away from that suspect, only to have that suspect be the actual murderer all along. Um, it's a bit hard to do in 20-ish minutes, so I think it's weak as a result of that, and so there's a lot of what we would now call fast cuts. But the opening of um, this is a magician's assistant, and she's getting married, and getting Lord Veneering, and then he's murdered, and then this other guy's suspect. It's just so fast that you kind of just get overwhelmed with detail and kind of stop thinking pretty fast that, well, maybe she killed him because she's pretty much the most obvious suspect.
It's almost a Ryan Johnson, where basically they put right up front what you need, what you see, or for this instance, what you hear, and then spend a lot of time trying to tell you that maybe that's not really what you saw or heard. Only at the end to go and say it exactly what you saw or heard.
Yeah, and that's one thing that was really fascinating re-listening to these, because I hadn't listened to any of these probably in over a decade. And so I was kind of listening to them like, are these actually genuinely good mysteries? And like you said, this one's not bad because um, it does some fairly modern techniques. So like you said, uh, let's do the obvious thing, but then immediately overwhelm you with information. Like I said, very Ryan Johnson. And then let's uh, fast cut to, like, especially near the end, where the Holmes seducing the murderer, which is just a weird sentence. Um, because, like, just kind of quick cuts of, I'm going for a date with this woman. I'm going, Lady Veneering, and you can't stop me. No, Holmes, don't do it. No, you can't tell me what to do. I'm Sherlock Holmes. Like, that kind of quick cutting is very modern in feel.
Most detectives, Eddie, only flirt with danger. Holmes marries
Right.
it.
But not legally, because Mycroft was the priest in disguise.
Oh my God, that was so much, and I think no, I gotta think now since we've listened to 5 of them. I'm trying to remember the order. If this was the one that had the disappearing ink also as a letterhead, is how he got
I,
off in a locality. No, it's not this one. It's a different
no, it's later.
one.
That's the later one. No, no. This is the one where the entire wedding was staged.
Okay.
Uh, because if the Reverend had actually, that's why Holmes said the Reverend's not going to perform it. He's going to be present, because the Reverend tried to be able to perform it. We find out Holmes said no, but you can come if you want to. Because if the Reverend had performed, it would have been illegal. It would have been a legal marriage. He would actually be legally married.
One of the things that I really do still enjoy about these, and I did as a kid, is relationship between Holmes and Watson, and it comes across even audio as well as it did in the actual movies themselves. And in here, at least in the audio form, it is a friendlier friendship than I think than what we saw in the movies.
Yeah. Like when, again, that's such a good one to start with, because when Holmes is trying to seduce this woman, Watson sounds genuinely concerned. Like, listen, everyone this woman has married has died. I do not want you to die. And Holmes kind of blows him off. Um, and it's done in a way where we're kind of sympathetic to Watson's point of, like, Holmes, you're being kind of an ass about this. We know it's Sherlock Holmes, so we know there's a plan here. But you could tell that these two are very warm, and I think some of that is the fact is that these two actors have been working together for, at this point, 6 years. So there's
Yeah.
probably an actual genuine friendship between the actors, and so the fact that it comes across in audio means it's coming across in their performance. I'm sure some of that is because these two men just know each other really well, and therefore know how to pitch these things so well.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that room watching them do it, because even if it was recorded live, just to see the looks and exchanges between the two of them while they were doing it would have been
Yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah. Especially because uh, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe a lot of these were recorded around one microphone at the time. So the actors had to be actually physically close to each other.
Hmm. I believe so. If not one, there would have been only a few, and there would have been more actors and actresses in the room to do all of it. So,
Yeah, a lot of
oh,
modern audio drama, each actor has their own separate booth and recording equipment. But in these days, yeah, they would have been sharing a
like
microphone pretty
one big
often.
room, because that's where you would have had like the Foley person also
Right.
doing noises and everything else.
Yeah.
I love it. Oh, maybe that's what I need to do. I need to go back in time and then just start my own radio station, and have to do it in disguise, though, much like Blue Marvel, so people won't know that I'm black when I do it. Otherwise, I won't be able to do it.
Right. Right.
Look at that. I've made a joke about the Ultimates in a Sherlock Holmes cast. Man, I'm on fire this morning. Too much
Oh,
coffee.
good job. Right. Anything else about this bonkers episode?
It's Sherlock Holmes effectively got married to catch a killer over the course of months, by the way, because we have that
Yeah,
jump of months before that happens. And the length of time for this feels longer than most of the cases in the novels do. So that was also a little, that took a beat to get used to since I hadn't listened to it in a little bit.
yeah, right. Because we have this perception, the kind of archetypal Holmes case is someone comes to his flat, he goes out to the scene, he looks at the scene that day, it's wrapped up by lunchtime or whatever. The idea that this case took months, yeah, right, that is kind of atypical of the traditional case.
And we have a more active Mycroft than what we have. Mycroft
Yeah,
is sitting somewhere smoking in the gentleman's club, telling Holmes what to do.
it's so funny because like if you look at these original stories, Mycroft only deviates a couple of times, but because Sherlock Holmes is popular, so people want to incorporate Mycroft more. Mycroft so frequently now deviates from his normal structure that the idea that he has a structure is just kind of weird and silly, um, which retroactively makes you think maybe Holmes was kind of lying about his brother being kind of lazy. Um, but it's plausible. Sometimes siblings,
Siblings.
yeah, will make you look bad. Anyway, moving on.
No, I think that's it for that one.
Okay.
No, you know
Uh,
what?
oh, one
He
more.
only caught her because he had a mirror in the room where he was looking when she tried to stab him. Eddie, how is that a good plan? What if he sneezed? What if he dedicated a fraction of a second longer to tie up his lace? Dead. Dead.
That actually leads to an interesting assertion that I kind of ascribe to, which is that because many of these stories and explicitly these radio programs are framed as Watson's recollections, not what actually happened, how much of Sherlock Holmes saying "I knew this all along" is real, and how much of it is him just showing off in front of Watson is really up for debate. So, like, you're right. In this episode, he's like, "Oh, I knew it was her all along." It's like, did you though? Or were you just reframing this to see who would jump out of the woodwork and you happen to look in the mirror at the right time to realize it was your own fake wife trying to stab you?
Yeah. That's it. That's my last comment because that was
Okay, moving on to the Amateur American Society. Watson rests after walking his dogs before he tells us a story which starts in 1887. So note that we're bouncing around in time here. Watson's
one quick
married.
question.
Oh, yeah.
Do we ever learn what type of dogs Watson has? Please proceed.
I mean, do you actually want an answer to that, or are you just being
Yes,
snarky?
I do. If you know, I was being flippant, but if you know, I will say I was hoisted on my own petard.
Because in a study in Scarlet, he makes a mention to having a bullpup when he was in with Holmes. Now, it's never mentioned again, and some people have argued that his reference to a bullpup is reference to his gun, but some people have pointed out that he also could be a bulldog puppy.
Hmm.
So the assumption is that when Watson's referring to dogs, he probably has bulldogs.
Awesome. Thank you. Petard hoisted.
I've unpetarded. That didn't sound good. Watson rests after watching his probable bulldogs before he tells the story, which starts in 1887. So this is when Watson's married. He's not living in Baker Street. So a mysterious woman who's known only as Number 7 arrives at his home asking for a doctor in a case of life or death. She drives into a secret club in a basement off the waterfront with a mix of people dressed in rags and high class. He's asked to treat a man named Julian who took a blow to the head, but Watson reveals Julian has broken neck and is dead. Number 7 pays Watson £5, which is a lot of money in 1887, and asks his name. As soon as she realizes his association with Sherlock Holmes, she begs him to forget everything he's seen. So Watson immediately does not that and tells Holmes, "Hey, this weird thing happened to me." At that point in time, Number 7 arrives at 221B and introduces herself as Lady Brownlee, part of the Amateur Mendicant Society, a group of rich people who get their kicks from pretending to be beggars. She believes Julian has been murdered, revealing him to have been the founder of the society. After Watson left, a fight broke out in the society on whether Julian tripped or was pushed into a fatal fall, and so Holmes reluctantly agrees to accept the case and sends Watson ahead to investigate. Watson questions some of the members. Lord Cecil claims that Lord Holt deliberately tripped Julian, but Cecil claims that Julian slipped. Suddenly, a new prospective member arrives, claiming he was invited by Julian, but is quickly unmasked as Sherlock Holmes. The whole scenario is revealed to be a trap, which Holmes knew walking in. Holmes explains the group invented the whole society as well as the implication there was a murder just to lure him in. In truth, they're a group of nihilists seeking to violently overthrow the government by assassinating the prime minister. Cecil and Holt threaten to murder Holmes and Watson by blowing the building up, but Brownlee refuses to go along, so she's tied up with the two detectives. A time bomb is set, and Holmes convinces Brownlee to confess to the group's plans before revealing his hands were already free and he could stop the bomb whenever he wanted to. The police, which Holmes called before arriving, capture the two nihilists, and Holmes decides he's put in a good morning's work. So when I was doing this, I was like, there's 5 episodes, 20 minutes each. It won't take me long to recap them. So much happens in these episodes.
You
They're like,
forgot that this is old school media where they pack a lot into a very short amount of time, unlike new school media where it's languid and it very little in a long amount of time.
yeah, like I forgot, like after I did this, I was like, oh yeah, I remember Dick Tracy was like 15 minutes when it was a radio program, but still a lot happened in 15 minutes. So yeah, like this is honestly 2 stories in one, really.
All right. So out of all the stories you listen to, this is the one I have the biggest issue with.
Really.
Yes. Because of the hook. I need a doctor. They just randomly sent me here. I didn't know that you were Dr. Watson. I didn't look at the door. I can't, that I don't jive with. Like, that is my biggest thing. I let your society of weirdos go. Your nihilist going to blow up somebody. I'm fine with all of that. It is a simple fact that it is by pure chance that you got sent to Watson.
Well, I mean, so the only logical thing I can say is if they were based in the waterfront, and she's like, okay, this guy fell, we need to find a doctor, so I'm just start knocking on every door I could find to find a doctor, which means she started from where he died or was injured, I should say. He's dead yet, and started knocking on every door they could from there on. Ergo, Watson lives by the waterfront, which I have issue with because that means Watson's making way more money than the stories have ever indicated he actually made. Because that's central London, and that's expensive.
That's why he was excited to get that $5.
Right. It's like, oh my god, this is, and he's maybe like, this is way too much money. It's like, no man, if you live in central London, that covers like maybe a day's rent. So you're like, yeah, thanks, £5. That's easily what I charge.
That is my biggest issue with the whole thing. None of the rest of it is just that by pure chance coincidence they stumble into it.
Well, it leads to an interesting point because like there's a reason why a lot of the adaptations almost never cover Watson's married time because it is so hard to bring Watson in when he's married and off with Mary Watson or whoever his wife happens to be. Um, when they're at 221B,
The
they
government
become
agent
Sherlock
that
Holmes.
shoots people.
Oh God, don't get me started on that. Uh, so no, when you're showing up to see Sherlock Holmes and Watson happens to be there, it's much easier to get Watson involved in the case. Where it's like, I don't know, a rich person thinking to be a poor person looking for a doctor, so she goes here, but then doesn't know who he is. I guess. Yeah, no, I agree with you. The ending is weak, but then after that, it's just glorious nonsense because there's so many twists. Again, 20 minutes. And there's so many twists in the story.
Having expressed my disdain for the start of it, I do love the fact that it lets Watson be proficient in what Watson does. Like, this is Watson's field. We get to see Watson go, this guy doesn't, he has a broken neck, like more detailed about what he does. And so that Watson is actually skilled. And there's a reason why he's running around with Sherlock.
Right,
Other
exactly.
than the fact that they're lovers. I stand by that.
And also, like when Holmes sends Watson, I was like, "Oh, you go investigate ahead. I'll be right behind you. I'm totally not going to come in disguise." Okay, but still, Watson does a decent job of getting the basic facts sorted out. It's like, I mean, we question people. I don't think these people. Watson thinks something's fishy from the start, so he's not wrong. It's just the thing is the whole thing's a trap, which again I love because Holmes is like, "I knew it was a trap all along." Did you though? Did you really?
I would say yes, because if we go back to when was it Lady Brownlee shows up, you have right before that the great banter between Watson and Sherlock trying to figure out what the initials for like the AMS are, and
Right.
Watson's like the American Medical Society or something, and you have
Yeah.
Sherlock going, Watson, that's a good idea, except it doesn't exist. So you get
Right. Yeah, I
that
love that.
banter still. So you know, and when she shows up, Holmes can tell her what the society name is. So that already shows you that he probably has 80% of it figured out.
Right. And that's fair, but the fact that it was fake wasn't part. It was a little bit like the I know it's a trap and it's for me, and I was prepared for all this. I'm like, okay, maybe you're making a little bit up on the fly, but still, um, I did like the whole because again, like the whole one thing I like about this is again that these shows are surprisingly smart, right? Because the people listening to this are probably been listening to this show for several years now. It's become a relative staple of the network. It's one of the bigger shows in the network. Um, so people are probably familiar with how a Sherlock Holmes story works. And so I am part of a society of rich people that tend to be poor people because we get our kicks off it. Sounds like the kind of bullshit that would be in a Sherlock Holmes story.
I'm gonna write that into a scenario. I hope you know.
I mean, the idea of rich people pretending to be poorer than they are is basically just today. So,
No, I'm
I,
gonna write that whole bit. I'm gonna write this whole bit into a
oh,
story somehow, like the
I mean, it is
around the
great.
time frame with them being nihilist. But maybe I'll put in a fantasy setting, and they have like a
I,
magic ball.
honestly, the whole thing is great. Like it's the and also again, it ages well in the sense of it's a bunch of rich people who are bored, and so they pretend to be beggars, but secretly they're actually nihilists. So don't blow everything up. It just plays really well. But again, I like the fact that at this point the audience is probably going, "Oh yeah, no, that seems like a plausible thing." Only for it to actually not actually be a plausible thing. Like if you were not a Sherlock Holmes fan, you would have known immediately this story was bullshit. But because you're listening to this episode, you're probably a Sherlock Holmes fan, and so you're bought in to find the reveal that it's actually was actually bullshit. So again, it's if
But
you think
the
about it for
thing
a
is,
second, it falls apart, but it doesn't.
you have Holmes deconstruct it after he says it exists by saying, "So, all right, that's what you do. Then why do you do it?" And then they say, "Well, we go out, we earn money, and then we give the money back. But then if you're giving money back, aren't you taking jobs from actual poor people that earn that money?" And you have
Right,
him deconstructing it to her as she's creating the lie for it.
right. And again, like so like full disclosure, I never heard this before. So this is the first time I listened to it. And so in the process, a rich person going, "Oh, I never thought about the consequences of my kicks on poor people," completely pliable to me. I was like, "No, that tracks. I'm 100% here for this." Um,
I want to take a minute to. I think you said her name was Edith something about how exceptional a writer then that Edith is to have done the other story and this story
yeah,
in
yeah,
rapid succession, right? Because the other one was March 26th.
yeah. It's a week apart. So I mean, she's writing a script a week.
Like, and
Yeah,
these are like full scripts. These aren't nothing scripts. So amazing.
yeah. No, I mean, again, like this is a solid mystery. Again, like the what is the mystery? And the other thing I like about the fact is that the last episode, right, was basically a long con, right? It was basically a con scheme. A black widow woman marrying people, then killing them off. That was basically just an elaborate, very weird con scheme. This is just about a spy thriller almost, right? Where it's like they're infiltrating an organization to find out they're another organization that are threatening the British government. So the fact is that not only are these decent mysteries, but they're also changing genre, which the original stories did. So yeah, Edith Meiser doing a really good job of channeling the essence of the original stories.
And if it works, I'm not sure the size of the studio since they were so popular, but it is likely that Edith was also writing a bunch of other scripts at the same time as us
Yeah,
for other
possibly.
radio shows. So that is the level of skill these people had to have, which is one of the reasons why I kind of love the time frame for the 30s and 50s for doing all the radio stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, um, if you compare this to other ostensible mystery shows, like because there was a Sam Spade show. There was The Shadow, whatnot. And frankly, I've listened to some of those. And those mysteries don't hold up as well as some of these Sherlock Holmes ones. Again, I was genuinely the first one I kind of saw where it was coming. This one I genuinely was sideswiped by. I did not know what was going on. It's like we're a bunch of nihilists. I'm like, what? Where the hell did this come from? But then that tracks. So no, it was a genuinely good twist.
How did you feel about Lady Brownlee's face turn at the end of it, saying, "I didn't know that you were going to kill Sherlock when we brought Sherlock Holmes and Watson into a death trap"?
Um, Again, a bit forced, but also like naive rich woman who didn't realize consequences of her own actions. Again, I kind of bought it before, so buying it again wasn't a huge stretch for me. But also did feel a bit like, no, we can't have the main female actor be seen as evil. There was a bit of like, I felt either a censorship or a rewrite or something around that, a whiff of something that just kind of a meh, but that was pretty minor, all things considered, in my opinion.
Do you think, now that we're talking about it, given the time frame, and if they were Sherlock fans, it is likely the nihilists that were captured would have been hung? Do you think there's a thought that we can't have people envisioning the woman also being hung, given the 1940s and when it would have came out?
I think so, or even the fact that we can't have a woman be seen in a place of being a terrorist, frankly, because what this is about women in society in the 40s. So like, I feel like there's some cultural, some ethos around that the face turn was very much felt like it was plot motivated. To be honest, it was not character motivated. There's no reason why she shouldn't have been right along with these guys.
All right. Other than Sherlock needs a witness, but yeah.
Right,
Which then
right,
goes back to plot and everything else.
right. Honestly, if she had been like, no, like screw these guys, I'm out, because I don't want to get caught, I would have bought that way better, right? So no, I'm selling these guys out. I'm on Team Sherlock now. Please give me a lighter sentence. I would have completely bought that. But just I didn't know you were going to kill people. It's like, you're talking about exploding buildings.
And you've got a dead body in the room where you're at. So it was a whole lot of death around her not to know that you're going to be killing a bunch of other people.
Yeah, it just seemed a bit odd to me. Also, minor note, this is something that a lot of Holmesian adaptations will do, is that uh, if you listen to the credits, you'll notice it says it's based off of a reference in the Arthur Conan Doyle, blah, blah, blah. I think it was 5 pips. And because a lot of times Watson in the original stories would say he was casually referenced to cases that were never written. And in one case, there's a case never written, then Conan Doyle didn't write up that case. But there's a lot of them, and one of them was, in that year that Holmes was investigating the case of the Amateur Mendicant Society, stuff like that. So this is one of those throwaway references that they then spelled out to a bigger actual story.
And a bit for other writers and creatives, always do that, because you create a whole
Yeah,
bunch of plot hooks and things for yourself to come back to at some later point in time.
yeah. I mean, I hate that I'm gonna do this again, but Doctor Who's famous for this. Like, there's kind of implications of other adventures the Doctor has, which gave wedges for people to write novels and audio spin-offs and whatnots to kind of fill that in. Yeah,
Because if you
it's always a good
don't
plan.
and you become very popular, they will randomly create them. For instance, with the Fifth Doctor, I think, right, where there's a moment where the Fifth Doctor steps out of the TARDIS for a minute and comes back in with Perry, and they create years of adventures in that 2 seconds he was gone.
Yeah, yeah. Or they just say, you know what? Screw it. There are more adventures. We're just not gonna talk. No, we're not gonna try to find a wedge. We'll just make it happen. Um, Whereas, yeah, like with other doctors, there's like just huge chunks of time that aren't accounted for. So like like the Seventh Doctor now has a huge gap of time. The Eighth Doctor has all the time in the world. So yeah, that's always great when you can do that. If you can leave gaps in your writing, it also gives you room. If again, you just becomes popular, you could do prequels and alternative takes, stuff like that.
In my headcanon, the Fourth Doctor and Romana and the Romanas have centuries long's worth of adventures, because they're both Gallifreyan and they're pretty much hanging out with the two of them in K9. So no one's really aged in that TARDIS.
Right, right. Um, uh, uh, I know we're digressing, but I don't care. I love how in the Big Finish they got a chance to do some of the first Romana adventures before she Mary Tam sadly passed. And I love the conceit is that yeah, we're doing the key to Kai thing, the key to time thing, but also the Doctor can't be arsed to stay on track for long. So they just have adventures because the Doctor gets bored, which I'm like, that's fair. It just happens.
And it's not like, all right, I think we didn't cover the key to time. So minor spoiler if you haven't paid attention to now a 60-year-old Doctor Who episode.
Yeah.
When the I'll be nice. When the White Guardian assigned the Doctor the task to do it, he didn't give them a timeline. He just said it's kind of important. And it's not like he's going to force him at that point to do anything.
Right.
So they could have bounced around forever.
Right. Exactly. Anyway, anything else about the Amateur Mendicant Society?
No, but I want to talk more about Romana 1 because Romana 1 is my favorite Romana. But we can move on. That's not pertinent to
We can
here.
move on. I know she's in Chris's crush corner. All right,
Yes.
Viennese Strangler. Vienna 1889. While Holmes and Watson relax after an investigation, a young pianist named Fraulein Uhlenstein knocks on the door to hire them about her blackmailer, who's a painter named Herr Shandor, who's sending a final demands before something nefarious happens. Her brother Karl, turns out, was wanted by the police, and Shandor snuck him out of the country before blackmailing his sister with a letter detailing his crime. Holmes goes to confront Shandor and discovers him strangled to death. They swiftly discover the letter as well as information on the case they just worked on. Wanting to know more about the incident, they question Li Tung-fu, a Chinese actor living across the hall, but Watson suspects Uhlenstein. Fu heard raised voices an hour ago, but seemed to know more about his neighbor than he lets on. Holmes talks to the reception desk for the apartment building to find out who else lives there, and decides to call upon the opera singer Signora Violetta, but she was practicing her singing and didn't notice anything. Holmes goes back to the scene of the crime, discovers that Shandor was blackmailing everyone in the building, as well as finding some long black hairs and marks from long nails. Since all the women had fair hair, they go to confront Li Tongfu, but they discover he's also been strangled. We join the story as Holmes and Watson question another resident, a Swedish sculptress. Watson confronts her because she has black hair, but Holmes immediately discounts him and ends the interrogation, sending Watson to Signora Violetta's room while he works alone. Violetta starts hitting on Watson when Li Tongfu comes to the door. She screams that she killed him once and she'll kill him again, and Holmes reveals he was disguised as Fu. Holmes explains he was the only one with long nails, as both the pianist and sculptor needed short nails to work. She killed Chandler for the blackmail and then Fu for witnessing her murder, but mistook Holmes for Fu because to her, all Chinese people look alike.
Mm. Mm.
I was listening to this. I was like, I don't know about this. Do I have to skip this episode? But I just genuinely love the fact that Holmes is like, she was undone because of her own racism.
So we've heaped a lot of praise. There was some questionable stuff about Jewish people in another one, and this is just straight up offensively bad for that.
Yeah.
I don't think we need to give another disclaimer because we gave one at the start of the Sherlock run. But
Right. I mean, it was 1940s, and certainly, it was progressive for the time, which is damning with faint praise, or I should say, praising with faint damnation. Um, but I mean, the fact is that there's an attempt to try to subvert what is perceived as the formula, because the episode's definitely pointing towards the Chinese guy did it, because that was very much a trope of the time, and they're trying to undermine that trope. So I give props for that attempt, but still, there's a lot of problems with this episode. The accents are all bad. I mean, not even just the Chinese actor; all the accents are bad.
part of me wonders if trying to subvert the trope is because it was a marginalized writer writing it.
Maybe entirely possible.
So further research on that needed.
Right. And I mean, we don't know the actors involved, but I could almost guarantee it was not a Chinese actor playing
it. Would not be.
Right.
I would bet you money right now.
Yeah,
it was
I would not take that bet because I would lose money. Yeah, but again, I left it in because I mean, it's good to see that it's still at the time, and they haven't divested themselves of these things. But it is interesting because, with few exceptions, Sherlock Holmes generally has had a pretty strong liberal slant as a property. The Gordon Doyle, as I talked about last episode, um, famously kind of rallied to the defense of an Indian student, and actually called out the racism in the police departments, which persists to this day in the UK. So he tried. But also, I mean, like other even adaptations of Sherlock Holmes and whatnot have had a lingering element to this, but again, to deeply mixed success. And this is definitely one of the falls into deeply mixed success. But uh, I recognize the effort, even if we do have to call out, it's still not good, and even for the time, it wasn't great.
I think I can say that Conan Doyle is better than Agatha Christie at it, and I'll
Yes,
leave it at that.
right. Yes, Agatha Christie would have probably had the Chinese guy do it. Let's put it that way.
There would have been a lot more racial slurs.
Uh, on
So
top of it, though, I mean, not only for that purpose, but also this episode isn't great just partially because it was really hard to follow what was going on. Right, this is one area where we talked about a lot happens in episodes. This one, I had to genuinely stop and backtrack in my adaptation because who was who and what the names were. Some of it was down to the quality of the recording; it wasn't great, the one I listened to. But also, it was a pretty muddy script, frankly.
yes, I agree. Although it was nice to get once again Sherlock playing music that Watson doesn't want to hear. It's always a nice, funny beat.
Right, right. Um, And at first, I was amused by Violetta because like, oh, it was a nice little bit of comedy relief inside of the story. But then it led into kind of uncomfortable. Oh, here's a woman hitting on a man who doesn't want to be hit on. So I was like, oh, this is basically sexual assault. Not a fan of that. And then she turns to be the murderer anyway, and also racist on top of it. And it was just like, okay. I mean, like I again, I appreciated the Holmes was like, I'm going to use a racism against her. So like I like the attempt at the beat there, but Violetta comes in very much in the second act of the story, and her motivations are very weak at best. So there's just way too much going on in this script. This is one where it was not well condensed into the 20-minute time run.
So then, would you just like to move on to the next one? Because I don't
Yeah,
think that one is worth more of our time.
right. But it was noted word that it existed in this time period. So next week, I believe there was a special of a sporting event, so there was no radio show that week. So we moved to April 23rd with a notorious canary trainer. The summer of 1908, and this is after Holmes had retired, actually. So Watson has encouraged Holmes to go vacation with him in a Kentish fishing village named Kingsgate. Holmes shares with Watson a note from Mary Victor, who is a girl who's staying at the same inn who is scared for her life. She explains, sorry, Holmes explains that he gets irritated by a couple of canaries that are singing from a window above them. And Watson mentions that he knows that they're owned by a couple named Mr. and Mrs. Wainwright. Mary Victor comes to visit them in their room and says she's come down from London to get away from a stalker, but she sees him again by the gate as she's telling the story. So she flees. The two detectives confront the young man at the gate, who turns out to be Basil Carter, who's working with Mycroft. He admits to planning a murder, but it's actually of the two canaries because they're also driving him crazy. Mr. Wainwright runs into them on his way to get some birdseed, and Holmes lies, says the canaries don't bother him at all, and mistakenly calls him Wilson. But Holmes later tells Watson that Wainwright is actually Wilson, who was a canary trainer they sent to prison some years back. The next day, after not seeing Mary all day, they go to see Wilson with a revolver at the end of the pier. They confront him and he confesses to a murder last night before he shoots himself. Later, Holmes confirms that Basil left hurriedly, and he goes to Mary's room to check on her. And they find Mary missing, but her room is in the process of her packing her bags. Mrs. Wainwright comes to see if Mary's returns and finds Holmes and Watson in Mary's room. Mrs. Wainwright isn't surprised by her husband's suicide and knew about his criminal past, but says nothing about a murder. She admits they were unhappy together and that Holmes suggests the suicide might have been faked, but the inn owner comes back admitting he found the body of Mr. Wainwright. Holmes notices that the canaries are silent despite being next to Wainwright's room. They enter and find the canaries dead, but they were chirping a few minutes ago when they entered the inn. The detectives go back to Mary's room to find out what appears to be a threatening note addressed to her. Holmes finds an American turn of phrase, and the postmaster reveals that an American came there by the name of Walter Bunker. They go to the inn to see where he's staying, which is a different inn, but he's not there. Last anyone saw, he asked for the nearest cemetery before leaving. At the cemetery, they find a wedding between Mary and Walter. Watson is disheartened by this dead ends, but Holmes triumphantly returns to the inn that they were staying at. Holmes telegraphs Mycroft and confirms that Basil was suddenly recalled by the government, eliminating another suspect. Mrs. Wainwright admits to killing the canaries because she hated them, but Holmes claims that she murdered her husband. It's revealed that Wilson actually did plan to fake his suicide and alluded to a fake murder to send Holmes on a false trail, but Mrs. Wainwright switched the blanks to live ammunition, effectively murdering him. Holmes says that Dr. John Thorndyke developed a test that can reveal fingerprints even if the gun has been underwater, so she confesses, but he later admits that the test was a lie, although Dr. Thorndyke did work on a case with Holmes. Way better of a mystery.
There was a lot too. That was
Yeah. There was a lot going. Again, there's a lot going on in this one, but this one was way better paced than the previous episode.
Yeah. Where would you even like to start unraveling this onion?
So I do want to do a quick note on the John Thorndyke thing. So John Thorndyke was actually another detective. He was a doctor who studied mysteries from a medical perspective. So he wasn't a character in the canon. He was not a Sherlock Holmes character. He was a completely different series detective. So it was neat to see that they worked that reference in to John Thorndyke here. It is an interesting way as Sherlock Holmes and other detectives start to fall into the public domain of people trying to push these characters together in the same universe, because in the very first story, Holmes references Auguste Dupin, so it sets the stage for all of these fictional detectives all actually know about each other. So it was a neat little touch, because John Thorndyke faking a medical test to get someone to confess is exactly the kind of thing that would happen in a John Thorndyke novel. So it was actually a cool touch, and it shows that Edith Meiser actually probably was very aware of a lot of the fiction at the time, not just Sherlock Holmes.
That's awesome. Like, I didn't have the additional context. Nice.
Yeah. But aside from that, I just really appreciated it. The game was a little hard to follow, but I genuinely appreciated how many twists and turns happened in this.
So in 1908, was Watson still married?
Up for debate. Oh boy, we get to go into the Watson lives theory. So how many wives Watson has is up for debate. It is generally assumed that he has 3. We know of Mary Watson, who was not a secret government assassin, but because of the sign of 4. He made certain sign of 4 and explicitly gets married at the end of the sign of 4. And so there's some stories where he references Mary, and other stories references his wife. However, in the final problem, I think it was, he references a recent bereavement, which generally assumed to be his wife dying. So there are canonical references to a wife after that point, but it's never explicitly referenced to Mary. So there's at least 2 wives. But because of the ordering of the stories, there's a nuance which I don't currently have off the top of my head. I have to dig up the references to. But there's a nuance to where there's a third wife that's kind of between Mary and that other wife after Holmes returns. And so there's evidence that implies that Watson's been married 3 times. Whether he's married by the time Holmes is retired, I believe he is, because I believe in one of the post-retirement stories, he references, is your wife okay with coming to visit me? So I think he's married at this point.
Okay. I'm just
Makes you a
saying.
long over answer.
No, it was a great answer. I'm just once again saying that Holmes and Watson sure goes on a lot of trips with Sherlock without his wife for extended periods of time. And if Sherlock is asking if his wife is okay with him visiting, that means the wife knows that they are a couple also. So they are in a throuple. I take a long way to get there, but I worked my way around to it.
Yeah, don't threaten me with a good time. And they're sharing a room, I'm just saying.
Wow. So it was the canaries thing. It was a bit much. Like the joke, is it possible to have a career as a canary trainer? Even in like we'll say 1880 to 1908. Is that an actual viable career option?
In Sherlock Holmes world, yes. I mean, if you could be a magician's assistant slash murderess, you could be a canary trainer slash murderer.
But magicians' assistants are well known for being glamorous and being like on the stage. This is someone who I've got a pet canary. All right, I'll bring in this person to train my canary for me for a week. There are some pennies for you. Go about your way. I'll let it go. I will not
I mean,
beat the canary.
the Amateur Minican Society proved to us that rich people will spend money on stupid shit. So yes, but I do love the fact that Holmes is like, oh, when I saw this guy, I knew that he was this other canary trainer that I sent to jail. And so the guy gets out of jail and changes his name and takes up the exact same common career that everybody has, which is canary trainer, and goes, I'll move to Kent, where Holmes will never go.
Well, he's not wrong because Holmes only went there because Watson said they needed a getaway together for a bit. And the only reason
Right.
they're vacationing in Kent.
Right. But it was just, again, like this guy strikes me as probably not being too bright because he also thought, I'll let my wife that I've been having fights with load my gun and that'll be fine.
Well, no, it's just that she snuck in afterwards. It's a lack of checking on, which I agree with you. It's a lack of checking on his part for something you're going to do.
I'll
But
be honest, if I'm going to fake my suicide with a gun, I'm going to make absolutely sure that gun is what I think it is before I pull the trigger.
I, on the other hand, would not be faking a suicide around the world's greatest detective. There is no way that is going to work out for you at all.
Right. The other thing that's awkward about this is that in the wake of now two well-known accidental deaths from people
Hmm.
from blank ammunition, we also know that this can't work. Even if he had blanks in it, he still would have probably died.
Yes.
So this is now a plot point that has not aged well because we know how blank ammunition works, sadly, and we know that people can point weapons even with blank ammunition and still accidentally kill people. So
To take a step back, though, I guess, instead of on that one, the inclusion of Basil Carter does that. I don't remember that character shows up in any of the other radio stories because it's been too long.
I
I'm
don't think
assuming
so.
it is also not an actual character from the novels because I don't remember any of that from Doyle's work.
No, I'm pretty sure he is just here to be a fake suspect.
A red herring.
Yeah, yeah. Which I didn't mind. Uh, uh, well, okay, I did mind it. I didn't mind the fact that he was there. It's like, oh yeah, there's a guy who's sneaking around, and it turns out to be someone who works for Mycroft, and the big twist is he actually works for Mycroft. Um, that didn't bother me because it's like, if you know the name of Mycroft, well, I take it back. I was about to say, if you know the name of Mycroft Holmes, you probably do work for him. But this is 1908 when Watson's stories would start being published, so Mycroft Holmes' names actually probably wouldn't public knowledge. So actually, I think that would be a reasonable bluff to assume. Um, but I mean, the thing is, like, he comes on, he has like 3 lines, and then we never hear from him again. Like literally off screen, was like, "Oh yeah, I radioed Mycroft, and that guy totally was legit."
Yeah.
So it's wrapped up a little too quickly to be a proper one. And I have bigger issues with. Um, I ran to London because this guy's stalking me. I find the guy stalking me. Uh, I think a different guy is actually following me, so I screw that up because I can't see very well apparently. But then the guy stalking me is the guy I'm marrying, and that just gets wrapped up in, oh, okay, well, you're married, that's good. Wait, you followed her from London. You sent her a letter, which was very ambiguously worded, by the way, to meet you in a cemetery to get married. It's like there's a whole story we have to unpack there that just there's glosses right over.
As someone who may have had in my younger years in high school have had dates with young ladies in cemeteries, I totally support the cemetery and vague noting. I
I
I
don't
am a
think
staunch supporter of that.
I don't think goths existed in 1945, Chris.
I bet they did. They were just underground.
This is underground, so they were secret goths.
No, they were Visigoths. All right, I could help myself. You made it too easy.
um, but no, honestly, like I, overall, I didn't mind this episode. I thought it was fun. Um, you're right, maybe a bit too many red herrings thrown in for the runtime. Probably could cut one pretty easily and been fine. But the actual twist of Mrs. Thorndike was unhappy. She's the murderer. Turns out she is the murderer by proxy. Was actually a neat little twist.
No, I am enjoying it. And then just like I said at the start, is reminding me of when I was a kid listening to these on repeat.
Yeah, absolutely. Ready to go on the last one?
Yeah. The constant reference to Mycroft, I understand why they want to use it. But from the episodes that we've had almost in complete succession, they've referenced Mycroft too many times. For me, I have being a Holmes reader and seeing how much Mycroft was mentioned in the actual novels.
Yeah, no.
And part of me wonders, is that because it was during the war and Mycroft worked for the War Department? And so it was
You know
a
what?
specific inclusion.
Maybe they're trying to, which actually may be a good point. Like if someone's a government employee working for the War Department, you don't want to make them a villain. So maybe that's why they made it very clear. No, that guy's legit. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about the war propaganda part.
And
Um,
also that, like, if Holmes keeps bumping into Mycroft's agents, if like we'll say the Germans are listening to it, that can make them also think that there could be like spies anywhere, even amongst us,
right.
which adds
Yeah.
back to more propaganda.
Right. It's the if we can sell this myth of British intelligence superiority, then that may dishearten the troops or embolden the allies, whatever.
Because it was working. They're both sides are doing something similar like to that. So it's now I'm thinking through more of it from like the psychological warfare aspect. All right, interesting.
Sure, but like that's actually a really good point. That's something we never touched on. Part of the reason why the Rathbone stories were so popular is because they were basically propaganda, right? It especially during World War II because it continued to sell this idea of British exceptionalism in terms of outsmarting opponents in tough circumstances. Sherlock Holmes is a perfect exemplar of that. So while not explicit propaganda, there's certainly, and as we listen to these, there's also references to war bonds and whatnot. So there is explicit propaganda in these. Um, but there's very much a cultural propaganda of we have to show people how smart and strong and brave our boys are. No, that's a really good point. I hadn't really thought of until you brought it up because this is 45, so the war is still an active going concern at this
Yeah.
point. Okay.
Anything else about that one? I don't. If you don't.
Oh no, the other thing I was going to mention was aside from all of that, which is really good. I'm glad we broke it down. Um, there's another piece where, and this is common when people do adaptations of things, is they like to reference things that happened before as a way of showing validity. Um, insert joke about the current season Doctor Who here. Put that aside for the moment. But there's a common thing of like, if I reference something that existed in a previous story that people liked, that proves that my story is more valid. And we're hitting an era where uh, Mycroft on a lesser level, but Moriarty on a greater level is badly overused as a way of trying to show validity.
Mm-hmm.
Moriarty's behind everything. Not quite in the radio series, but certainly in the movies. Moriarty is just the bad guy of the movies, straight up. We saw that in the second movie we saw last episode. That's a going trend in the other films. We get less in the radio show, but Mycroft comes up because if I can name drop things from the stories, the idea is that it helps these things fit in better. The problem for me is that sometimes you're right. In this case, the name drops get a little too heavy handed. And it's like, is there literally no other government employee these people could possibly work for? right? Does Holmes not have anybody else he can ask for favors?
And I don't remember them well enough because there's so many of them. If Irina Adler ever came back up in any of these stories, because that would be another good name drop to add sprinkled throughout.
In the radio series, I'm pretty sure she did get referenced, and she got referenced obliquely in I think 2 other stories, but only as the woman. Her name actually never came back. She was just the woman after that. Irene Adler, I'm
But I
almost
meant
positive came back in the radio show.
I meant like the heavy footstep, how they're doing Mycroft, like Mycroft, Mycroft, Mycroft. If there was maybe a season or somewhere sprinkled throughout where they go like the woman or Adler, 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 woman, woman, woman.
I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't do that maybe in some of the earlier stuff we don't have access to anymore. But with the shift to the war, that's why it makes sense the Mycroft's more coming to the fore. But I wouldn't be surprised if before that, if Irene Adler and probably if Mike and Moriarty probably weren't heavier referenced.
Interesting.
Anyway, move on to the unfortunate tobacconist. We're now in 1906. Holmes notices how 3 tobacconists have all died in the past 6 months and all in the same shop in the East End, which, as we all know, is a hive of scum and villainy. I say this having moved from Hackney. Lestrade appears to discuss the murdered tobacconist after talking to the owner, Jack Longsworth. Jack inherited the shop from his father, and after the original resident had a stroke and vacated, Jack tried to rent the shop out, but the first tobacconist had his throat cut, a second was strangled by a scarf, and a third got a knife in the back. Now the original residents are back in the shop, and Lestrade is worried for their safety. Mycroft, again, calls Holmes, and Sherlock deduces that Lestrade is working on behalf of the government. Going to the shop, 3 men find a bearded man lurking around the shop before talking to Lily, who manages the shop. Her father is out, but Jack Longworth is in and meets them. Lily admits her father was outraged when Lily gave up the lease on the shop. Holmes asks everyone except Watson to leave to lure the bearded man in. The man turns out to be working with Mycroft from the Foreign Office, and Holmes lets him go. Later, Holmes meets up with Lestrade and Lily's father, Grillet, who disapproves of Lily's relationship with Jack. Grillet thinks the murders are down to lower the property. The murders are designed to lower the property value so it can be sold cheap to a concern that's seeking to tear the place down so they can widen the docks. He reveals he's gotten a threatening note and asks the 3 detectives to hide in the back before the assassin arrives. The door between them is locked, and it appears they've arrived too late to prevent a 4th murder, but Holmes realized the attack was faked because the door didn't creak when it was opened. Grillet was the real murderer, and Holmes reveals the shop is the center of an espionage ring, which is why Mycroft is so interested in the case. And I admit, at this point in time, I was like, okay, now that I've done 5 of these in a row, the constant twists were getting a bit much for me.
To some extent. The thing is, though, if we had been listening to them in real time, we wouldn't have had as much media as we have now, but they would have been spaced out by a week.
Right. Right. It wouldn't have
So
been
this
as
is
much.
part of our format that also does some of this.
Yeah, and I mean, like, once you get on board with the okay, there's going to be a couple of twists in it, you start to kind of see the format and the structure it's going in. I still found this episode charming. In particular, again, a better version of what we talked about a couple episodes ago, where the bearded man, he's painted as being foreign, but then it's like, oh, he works for the Foreign Office. Okay, well then that's a perfectly good reason for him to be foreign. So the episode does try to play with the maybe he's the sinister person, but it divests of that pretty quickly. It is not like the problem with Fu was he was the potential suspect for way too long, whereas this one it's like this guy was suspect for maybe 5 minutes. And again, Mycroft is the reason why we get to divest ourselves of that. So it's a nice way, again, in this wartime setting of saying, no, some people who may look suspicious actually do work for us and are good guys, which was a neat little touch for the time period.
Which goes against a lot of the propaganda that even the U.S. government was using when they'd use for black troops that they would send off to fight with other countries like the French. And then they'd send paperwork over telling them not to treat them too well. So when they got home, they wouldn't be used to that. So
Right.
the exact opposite of the real world and what the government was doing.
Oh, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, again, at some level, this is propaganda, right? We talked about that. But the 2 issues I have with all of this, one, again, as I jokingly referenced earlier, didn't like the fact that it's the implication of, well, you have a tobacco shop in East End, so you should expect a certain amount of murder. Wasn't a fan of that at all. Because it's pretty heavily implied that like, well, you kind of set yourself up for that because you opened up at the East End. It's like, really, really, Holmes. Uh, but the other one is, uh, I don't, I still don't. I listened to this episode. I actually had listened to it, a chunk of it, twice when I wrote this summary. I still don't entirely know what Grillet's plan was
I don't know. To be mysterious, to cause havoc.
because like up until near the end, I was like, you were renting this place out and you were trying to lower the property value so that Jack would sell it to you as the previous resident so you could sell it to this docs. I was on board with that. And then at the last minute, it's like, no, it's all an espionage ring. What?
Because you needed Mycroft to be interested in it. And Mycroft isn't going to be interested in property values. That's like a Lex Luthor movie Superman plot. That's not, it's irrelevant.
Oh God. Um, yeah. So it's uneven. I mean, and frankly, it comes down to like if you just kind of trim a few lines off the ending, it would be fine, right? Like it was just a last minute twist that just didn't need to be there because you're right. It was the well, we have to explain why Mycroft's interested. It's like just you know, guy's suspicious. We investigated him. Turns out he's not involved in anything. He's just trying to do property fraud and murder.
And
So
it was, for me, this was a nice change because we had Lily not be a villain or antagonistic in this story compared to some of the other women that we've had pop up so far. And she was
yeah,
trying to give them clues without saying specific things. So that was
right,
a nice beat for me to see and for me to hear for the story and for
right.
Holmes to acknowledge it.
I do want to remark though that this and actually most of these episodes, we've talked before about mysteries playing fair in the sense of the audience could have figured it out if they're listening carefully. And I think the other thing that bothered me with Viennese Strangler is that there's really no real way to do that because it required such a visual clue.
Yeah.
But the other ones are really pretty good. Of like at the end, I was like, oh, actually, I probably could have figured that out. And this is actually a great one because they really lean on the door opening creaking sound effect to the point where I was getting irritated by it. I'm like, why are they leaning on the sound effects so much? And then when the final reveal came, like we didn't hear a sound effect. It's like you're right, I didn't hear the sound effect. I was specifically annoyed by the sound effect. I should have been thinking about that, and then I forgot about it. So it was really well paced because the first half it kept creak creak creak, and then they stopped doing it for a while. I forgot about it, and then like that was the thing you should have been paying attention to. It's like that's actually really good. It's a pure sound based clue.
That is a great Foley person if they annoyed you that much with it.
Yeah,
So they're
yeah.
doing their job.
No, it's perfect. Like I wasn't mad about it. It was just more like the well, at the moment I was like that's a little irritating, and it's but the thing is that it's stuck in my head. So that's perfectly what playing fair is like. If it's pitched well, the reader, or in this case, the listener, should go, "Oh, I absolutely should have caught that." Right? If it's buried too deep, they'll go, "How should I have remembered that?" They know I should remember that because it was just a little too heavy on it, just enough to get me to stick in my head and then fall out when it needed to.
A slight weird question for you, but it's something that you've mentioned. And if you're not ready to discuss it, that's fine too. Can you give a little bit of breakdown of what the class system might have been around this time period, given the comment about East End and expecting a bit of crime there? Well, like what's the British class
Oh,
system?
sure, sure, yeah. Um, I can't speak to all the areas of London, but I could talk to. Holmes is based in central London, and we're talking about the East End here. So those two things I can talk about. Central London, then as now, is very much the moneyed part of London. That's where uh, Buckingham Palace, Buckhouse is. That's where most of the government's structured, where a lot of the financial institutions are. If you live in central London, it is one of the most expensive places to live. Most expensive places even to get hotel rooms, even. But that's also where a lot of it's centralized London, right? Most of the things you think of in London are in central London. The East End is where you get a lot of the more of the blue collar people who did those shit jobs in central London, usually lived in the East End, and other parts of the city too, but South London as well. But also, it is one of the more distinctive accents. So Cockney, for example, is probably the most common accent. And there's a very Cockney accent very much gives a certain class resonance even today, in terms of being blue collar, lower class. It was also the East End is also where Whitechapel is, for example. Whitechapel is, where the Whitechapel murders happened. And again, a lot of uh, the reasons why the Whitechapel murders were so horrible is because people didn't realize it was a trend of murders for a long time because it was just people in Whitechapel being murdered. So it was an East End problem. Uh, so uh, and Hackney, again, where I mentioned live before, that's where the term hack comes from for taxis, because Hackney cabs were people lived in Hackney and had their cabs in Hackney. They would
Hmm.
come into central London to pay around. They got shortened to hack, and hack then became slang for a cab when motorized cabs came around.
Cool.
The East End also in World War II was bombed to hell. A lot of the East End did not survive when London was bombed. So a lot of the East End has since been rebuilt. So the East End getting this connotation in 1945 is particularly a little like, it's not great, um, because a lot of it was devastated during the wars. And so when they were rebuilt, it rebuilt, and also I can't speak to prior to World War II, but since World War II, a lot of what's known as the Windrush generation, people who came in on the Windrush from Jamaica to live in England, a lot of them end up living in the East End. So it's also there's a bit of a racial component as well, because that's where a lot of non-white people ended up having to live because it was relatively affordable housing. Now the East End is becoming more reinvigorated, particularly around the time of the Olympics. A lot of the Olympic stuff was set there, and so there's a lot of rebuilding happening in the East End, and it's starting to become gentrified now. But still, there is a class thing with people speaking with a specific East End accent are seen as lower class, even if it's not true. There's a fantastic television presenter. His name is Jay Blades, who is a black man who's lived in the East End all of his life. He has a very strong Cockney accent. He does a lot of furniture restoration right now. He's been a TV presenter for close to 10 years now. And he's very proud of his heritage, but that's something that he constantly struggles with, is that people look at him as like, oh, well, you're just a black guy from Hackney. You sound like a black guy from Hackney. So you fit this category, even though he is a well-respected TV presenter, does amazing work with antiques restoration, and he's now the lead presenter on a show called The Repair Shop, which is one of the more beloved restoration shows going on. So there is still very much a cultural thing going on. He has a great autobiography about where he talks about these struggles, and also as a result of that, some people are trying to downplay their accents, and so there's actually been a research that people trying to recover not only the Hackney accent but also Hackney rhyming slang, because people have been embarrassed about their accents and their slang and have been trying to downplay it as a result. So that's a long way of saying that this is something that's been going on since the 19th century and is still going on today. And it's now taken on some new connotations over the past 10 years because of the gentrification and whatnot, since 2012 at least. But it's still having I lived for a year there. We're now in northern London. It's a different dynamic, but we still, frankly, we couldn't afford to live in Hackney anymore because it becomes gentrified. So that's part of the problem. But we loved living in Hackney while we were there because it was such a great, vibrant, diverse chunk of town. Like uh, there's a census that I think it was like 300 languages are spoken in London, and most of them are in East and South London.
Wow.
So it would not be. I would go to coffee shops or in the tube or whatnot, and it would be not at all surprising to hear all sorts of different languages being spoken around me, which was amazing. I loved it. But yeah, so some of the American audiences, and to be honest, a lot of people listening to this were Americans, would have no clue about this. They're like, oh, I think, isn't that where Whitechapel's at? Maybe if they were lucky. So most of this would have been just a shot across the bow that made no sense to them. But as someone who now has lived in that area specifically, I was a bit like, really though? I don't know.
No, because one of the things that we mentioned is that when you moved over, is that we'd been very U.S. in some of our thinking. And so this was
Mhm.
a chance to sort of expand it out, since you have additional context and insight now that we could share it with our listeners wherever they are, but give like an idea of the different culture. Because I, as an
Totally.
American, had vague notions about some of what you've talked about. And I like to consider myself a bit of a researcher, and I didn't have that level of detail. And I liked it.
No, totally. This is all I absolutely picked up since moving here. Like prior to then, I knew the East End existed, and again, like I've been like Whitechapel happened there, so I guess yeah, sure, people. That's a horrible part of town. Um, it's not. I mean, the East End, the areas I lived in were great and wonderful, but people who had lived there for a long time, I had some conversations with them, and yeah, they were like, "Yo, this is." But again, it's interesting. I'm now off a tangent, but I don't care. Um, One of the other side effects of all of this is that because it was seen as a quote unquote lower part of town, lower class part of town, it's also where a lot of queer people in London ended up going and building up their community because it was safer there. And so there's also not only outside of the diversity in terms of race, but also a strong uh, pride in their queerness in the East End.
Excellent.
And so there's been interesting intersections of how that ties into things like the East End accents and whatnot, and how that comes out, because it, the East End accent is not seen as quote unquote sexy. So you have a lot of queer East End people who are trying to again bury their accents. So that ties into that loss of culture, but still that was an area where they felt safe. So there's a lot of interesting
Hmm.
intersectionality that's happening as a result of all of this.
Oh, I love it. Oh, that's awesome. Um, all right. So back to Petri wine. Any other closing thoughts about the unfortunate tobacconist?
uh, I think I pretty much covered it. I mean, again, like it's the what was actually happening was a bit loose, but like most of these, it was just a solid mystery, which I was frankly a little surprised by when going back and re-listening to these.
Yeah. On the whole, I think they still hold up pretty well. That's
Yeah,
somewhat surprising, but then not so, because one of the things that I've been ranting about recently and probably for a long time is that good writing is essential to have something to be rewatchable, re-listenable to, and continually engaging upon repeated viewing, watching, or listening, because the visuals and the big budget are great and they may distract you from the first viewing or second viewing of something. But if you're going back to watch it again, the writing is what has to stand out. And then the acting with the writing of any kind is what makes it an ongoing thing that you grow up with or sticks to you.
yeah, and radio drama in particular, it is a very pure form of that because all you have are actors and sound effects to convey it. And so if the writing's weak, there's not much that good actors and good sound effects can do to cover it up. There's some, but not a lot. So if the writing's weak, it's going to be pretty clear. And so that's all these folks had to convey this art form was good writing, good actors, and good sound effects, and that's it. And so all three of them, if any of it was weak, the whole suffered. And so, yes, some of it's aged badly. Yes, some of it was definitely of its time. But I'm with you. I've always been a huge fan of old time radio, and uh, there's actually a few companies or individuals now who have been trying to use AI and other tools to remaster these things. Um, and so there've been a few like podcasts popping up of just kind of replaying these people to find again. Uh, there's one where uh, they take like 3 or 4 random mystery shows and package up like an hour and a half podcast episode. And so it's been interesting to re-listen to these because like it's surprising, not I guess not surprising given what you just said, but like it's heartening how much of this these hold up. And even things like uh, uh, the comedies are just really funny still, even though the jokes are very dated. But sometimes the patter is dead on. And these Sherlock Holmes ones, like not only are they good mysteries, but also the camaraderie between Holmes and Watson is very prevalent in all of these. Even when Holmes is just being miserable to Watson, you still
And
get a sense of friendship.
I would be remiss if I didn't also give a shout out to, while somewhat more problematic, but still somewhat enjoyable, would be the Western radio dramas from the time, because there are
Yeah.
so many of them. And some of them are good, but they are more inclined to have racially related issues
Right.
than what Holmes and Watson were.
Right. Right. Also, you'll be happy to know I have finally remembered the show I was trying to think of. You Bet Your Life is the show I was trying to think of with Groucho Marx.
Oh, awesome. Did you think of it, or did you side Google it when
I
no
said
one was
Google it.
looking?
I said Google
Yeah. Yeah. Called out.
it.
Ooh. If you don't have anything on this, I guess I can tell people what we're doing next
Yeah, what's
time.
going on next week?
Next week, we move to the 1950s with Ronald Howard Sherlocks. And you'll probably have to find these on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And it'll be the case of the Cunningham Heritage, case of the Pennsylvania gun, case of the Texas cowgirl, case of the belligerent ghost, and lastly, case of the shy ballerina. So she's definitely not the ballerina from John Wick.
No, no, she's not. Um, yeah, and these are they're all again all in public domain. We're reached the ends of our public domain stuff, so they should be pretty easy to find on YouTube or a fair number of download sites. Uh,
Would it? So this is on air, like stuff as we're still figuring out. Is it possible for us to include a link to YouTube, or is that any sort of violation if we do it to these? I think it would be okay if they're public domain, right?
yeah, I mean, I I've been avoiding putting these into the show notes because one thing we learned since I moved overseas is that not everything is streaming everywhere, and so it became increasingly hard to find those. But since I I'm gonna put caveats here. For the radio shows and for next week's episodes, I think they're available in all areas. So I'll try to put links in for just these two episodes, because again, they're in the public domain, so they should be available. But YouTube is very weird about copyright strikes on the best of days.
Yeah.
So I can't guarantee anything. So I'll try to put links for at least these two. If you can't find them, a Google of Ron Howard Sherlock Holmes should probably find you next week's episodes.
Appreciate it.
Cool. So, if people are wanting to talk to you about old time radio, Chris, where would they find you?
You can find me at petrywine.com. Where I'll be sitting around with a good fire and oh no, I'll be at Dark Crew Studios. You could pick up Haunted West. I've still got some copies left, or go to Chaosium's website. Forget Harlan Bouncing Edition. If you want to talk to me about Petri Wine, you could do so in the Darker Hue Discord, or on my Patreon, where I will put up a video of me drinking wine that I will make a fake label that says Petri on it, just for you all. What about you?
I imagine it literally be like a white sheet of paper with like Petri and like Times New Roman just taped on.
You know me too well.
If you can find me, you can find me on Pug Steady. That's my company. It's my website. If you want to find me on the Darker Hue Discord, you can. Um, Probably by the time you're listening to this, I will be talking about Doctor Who again. I'm trying to take a break from it because I had too many opinions in the last season, and I want to kind of take a break to decompress a bit from them. But I have to talk about most anything else there. And also, if you want to throw me some money, the best way to do that is to check out my amazing game about fantasy dogs called Realms of Pugmire. You can find that at realmsofpugmire.com. So, with that, we will see you next week. We talk about the Ron Howard episodes in the 1950s.
Peace.